When the remains of a young woman were discovered inside a suitcase found off the coast of Italy, detectives were hopeful this suitcase would help solve a murder case. Instead, this suitcase opened up a whole new mystery. This is the story of one suitcase, two women, and how one woman's desire to be perfect drove the other to the brink of madness. Welcome to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm your host, Nancy Miller. And I'm not sure what happened. Maybe it's all of the Edith Wharton stans out there, but I suddenly have an influx of listeners, which I'm extremely grateful for. There are a lot of true crime shows out there, and I know people are choosy with the shows they follow. I created this show for people like me, people who like to fall asleep to true crime and want stories that focus on the people, the complexities, the conflict, and the consequences. And a note about tonight's episode. As always, there are no graphic depictions of violence in this story, but we will be hearing about bodies, a dead body. And if you're squeamish about those things, I recommend you skip this one. Your mental health and sleep hygiene are more important than a true crime podcast. And with that, let's settle in for the night. Get comfy under that comforter. Close your eyes and get ready to fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. As we head over to the lapping shores of Italy. It was springtime in Rimini, Italy, 2017. If you caught the previous episode called The Suitcase, you'll remember the beautiful beach town of Rimini, Italy was just ramping up for the tourist season when a local fisherman spotted a dark blue suitcase bobbing in the water. He opened the suitcase, revealing a trash bag. Inside the trash bag were the remains of a person, a woman. Italian authorities thought they knew exactly who this woman was, and they'd hoped this discovery would help them solve the case of a missing cruise ship passenger who disappeared while on a Mediterranean vacation with her family a month earlier. Then the Italian authorities turned the suitcase and the remains over to the medical examiner. And that's when authorities learned the facts didn't add up. This body wasn't their missing cruise ship passenger, which meant local Italian authorities had a whole different case, a whole new mystery. Who was this woman, and how did she end up curled inside a suitcase? They had no idea. There was no ID, no tag on the suitcase, and no time to waste in figuring out what was going on. Because it was late March, early April, the off-season for a resort town like Rimini. Things are typically quiet in the off-season of any beach town. Mostly locals, not much action, and that's how people liked it. Any hint that a tourist town wasn't safe, especially for a young woman to travel to on holiday, could lead to financial ruin for a beach town that made most of its revenue during that short window of vacation season, May through August. They needed this case figured out before word spread, before any nervous tourists changed their travel plans. So who was this woman? Finding out her identity was, of course, step one. Here's what they did know. After the body was brought to the morgue and examined, they determined a few basics. This woman in the suitcase was in her mid-20s. She was around 5'6" or 7 inches in height. At first, they thought she was Asian. Then they determined she was likely Caucasian, possibly from Eastern Europe. There were thousands of women in Italy who could fit this description. But there was something unusual about this woman's body. Something disconcertingly distinct. The dead woman's body weight. When this young woman was alive, the medical examiner determined that she weighed 35 kilos. That's just 77 pounds. A baseline healthy weight for a woman who is 5 feet 6 inches tall is closer to 118 pounds. It was clear to the medical examiner that this woman suffered from severe malnutrition, and her frail condition was directly connected to her cause of death, according to the examiner's findings. This woman appeared to have died from complications caused by her malnutrition. To put it bluntly, she starved to death. Then, the examiner said she was either dead or very close to dying when she was placed inside the suitcase and plunged into the Adriatic Sea. So Italian authorities knew the nature of her death, but the rest, who she was, how she ended up in the suitcase, and who put her there, was as murky as the ocean water she was found in. The neglected remains of a young Eastern European woman, discarded in the open water, one couldn't help but consider a grim but all too common scenario. Was this woman a victim of human trafficking? Recent statistics around human trafficking, especially in Italy, supported this theory. Human trafficking was rampant in Italy, with numbers in the thousands. According to a 2019 report published by Save the Children in Italy, nearly 35% of young women and children brought to Italy for forced labor or prostitution were from Eastern Europe, including countries such as Romania, Albania, and Bulgaria. In 2017, when this woman's body was found, Italy had stepped up its efforts to address the issue. But the fact was, human trafficking was a ruthless, intricate web of deception and control, a web that could trap a young girl for years. Was this 20-something woman somehow connected to the trafficking trade, a casualty of a life lived and lost among strangers? There are thousands of stories that could end like that. And according to a 2021 study by the U.S. State Department, the effects of the pandemic, climate change, and economic inequality has increased human trafficking worldwide. But the woman in the suitcase, that wasn't her fate. Fingerprints taken by the examiner in the morgue revealed the woman was a Russian national. A few days later, Italian investigators even had a name: Katerina Laktionova. And as they dove into the investigation and the circumstances around her death, they learned that Katerina's story wasn't about strangers. It was about family. And just how far circumstances could drive the people closest to you to do shocking things. Things that were past the boundaries of reality, past humanity, and into a darkness so deep, there was no hope of turning back. But let's start with a happier time. It was 2015, 2 years earlier, when a beautiful Russian girl named Katerina moved from Russia to Italy to fulfill a dream. Katerina dreamed of being a model, which made perfect sense. Many of the world's top models were Russian, and similar to Russian ballerinas, the image of the Russian model came with a certain expectation, a physical ideal. Tall, lean, strikingly, stunningly beautiful. And Katerina was a natural for that look. Already a dancer, model, and college student back in her native Russia, it seemed being in front of the camera was part of Katerina's DNA. In professional photos found online, Katerina is pictured posing in a polka-dotted two-piece swimsuit, slim legs resting daintily over a chair. Her shiny brown hair, almond-shaped brown eyes, and prominent cheekbones come alive on camera. But modeling was a tough business, and some essential, albeit outdated, characteristics required for a successful modeling career came down to genetics. And there were things that could be changed and other things that couldn't. At around 5'6", Katerina was short by traditional modeling agency standards, which typically started at 5'9". And at 25, Katerina was on the mature end of modeling, which didn't mean she wouldn't get work. But most models with long careers started out in their teens. It was a fact. Katerina couldn't control how tall she was or the year she was born. But she could control her body in another way, the way many successful models were pressured to do. Katerina could control her weight. Just a warning here. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to describe aspects of anorexia nervosa and disordered eating. Now, it was unclear when Katerina was clinically diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, but members of her family reported that well before she moved to Italy, Katerina engaged in some form of disordered eating, including severe food and caloric restriction back home in Russia. Her stepbrother said in an interview that she always wanted to be a model, and she was obsessed, he said, with being perfect. In 2015, Katerina relocated to Rimini, where her 40-something mother, Gulnara, lived and worked as a caregiver. As a beach town along the coast, Rimini wasn't a convenient location for an aspiring model. But it appeared Katerina loved Rimini, and as she'd soon realize, advancing her modeling career wouldn't happen as she might have planned. Because what did advance, at a rapid pace, was her illness. Her condition required several visits to local hospitals for urgent treatment for malnutrition. Her mother would later say Katerina resisted psychological treatment to address her disorder. But in 2015, when Katerina first moved to Italy, she recognized her illness was serious enough to apply for and receive a special residence permit under the category of humanitarian and health protection. This special residence permit allowed Katerina to legally stay in the country and receive health care and other social services from the Italian government for a period of 2 years. Without this special humanitarian and health status, Katerina risked living in the country illegally, which also put her health at risk. If she needed care, her mother would have to pay out of pocket for treatment around Katerina's illness, a cost her mother couldn't afford. The permit was set to expire in 2017. For Katerina, the continuation of this special status to keep her in the country was a matter of life and death. It was a great effort to have the energy and the determination to leave the house. One of the last times, possibly the last time Katerina was seen out in public alive, was that February in 2017. She'd already been hospitalized several times for life-saving, urgent care to treat her condition. But she managed to make it in person to the authorities in Rimini to renew her special residence permit. She explained her condition and told authorities she needed to stay in Italy for her recovery. She emphasized that without this continuation of treatment, she could die. Sadly, her request was rejected. She was told she was not going to be receiving this special status, and she'd have to go back to Russia and leave Italy. The specific reason for the denial of her request wasn't clear. Taking a step back, Katerina was one of thousands unwittingly caught up in a growing anti-immigrant sentiment that was affecting public policy. It was all over the news. Thousands of migrants were coming to Italy via North Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Mediterranean, which meant a sharp increase of refugees seeking asylum or humanitarian protection status. Their circumstances were different, but the status they sought, that special protection, was akin to what Caterina had. Around that time, a conservative movement in the Italian government pushed for tighter restrictions around special protection status. These strict policies would become law by 2018. In photos, Caterina was the perfect girl, but on paper, to immigration, she was an unwanted foreigner. Caterina begged to stay, but these circumstances were beyond her control. When Caterina's protected status was turned down, she was just one of thousands cast out in that sweeping crackdown. She was now fighting for her life. Authorities rejected her special visa request in February of 2017. Days later, Caterina disappeared. It was March 10th, 2017, 15 days before the discovery of that suitcase. One of Caterina's friends was on the phone. He'd been trying to reach Caterina for days, and he'd gone from generally concerned to gravely worried. Where was Caterina? At last, on that day in March, a phone call. It was Gulnara, Caterina's mother. She and Caterina had left Rimini, and she was taking Caterina to a well-known specialist. There was no reason to worry. Everything was fine. But the friend noticed something wasn't right. The call was coming from a local Italian number, which didn't make sense. Gulnara said she was in Russia. When this friend pressed her for more details, she seemed agitated and vague. What was also strange is, why would Gulnara take Caterina to Russia for treatment when Caterina had come to Italy because Russia didn't have the treatment she needed? What was she really doing there? What had really happened? After the call, this friend became suspicious, but he didn't know what to think. Until around 2 weeks later, on that ominous day in late March, this friend saw the news that a local fisherman had found a suitcase. There was a young woman inside, identity not yet known. This time when Gulnara called, she did appear to be calling from Russia with a Russian number, and this time the friend asked her point blank. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Is your daughter alive or dead?" Gulnara, on the other end of the phone, burst into tears. She couldn't keep her secret anymore. She said she would tell him everything, and what she told him was shocking. And it was, she swore, the truth. After the call, the friend ran to the Rimini police station. He frantically revealed everything that Gulnara had told him about what happened to Caterina. The shocked authorities issued an arrest warrant for Caterina's mother. What the hell happened? "I'm ready to explain everything," Gulnara said in a hushed tone over the phone. She was speaking from her family's home in Russia to her lawyer back in Italy, where authorities were waiting for her to take her into custody. It was April, and investigators were desperate to figure out what happened to Caterina. What did her mother know? What did her mother do? Gulnara confessed what she could remember. She swore that she planned to take her daughter back to Russia alive to get help. That first phone call with the friend, she was still in Italy. She wasn't in Russia. But that second time, she really was in Russia. But Caterina was not. Gulnara described how she felt helpless. Caterina had been hospitalized several times in recent months. She described how she was desperate to get Caterina into a special clinic in Italy, but couldn't afford the cost. Gulnara described how Caterina never left the house, never left her room. She described the wasting away of Katerina's body as a candle being consumed by its flame. Then one day in March, Gulnara went into Katerina's room and discovered her daughter lying there, lifeless. Gulnara remembers that moment. She said it was a blur, bits and pieces, that when you put them all together, went something like this. After discovering her daughter in bed, Gulnara didn't rush to call an ambulance for any Hail Mary life-saving efforts, or the police to report her daughter's death. She didn't frantically dial Katerina's father back in Russia, or that friend in Rimini. Instead, Katerina's mother did nothing. No, that's not quite right. She did something. She sat down next to her daughter's body and stayed there. One day went by, then 2, 3, 4, then 5. For 5 days, she sat there in willful disbelief. Her daughter wasn't dead. She couldn't be. Gulnara was a trained caregiver, so she knew a dead body when she saw one. But she described experiencing a grief so powerful, it quickly turned to madness. A kind of hysterical denial that pushed her to do what most would find unthinkable. After sitting with the body for 5 days, Gulnara, a middle-aged woman of average strength, somehow lifted her daughter's body, still around 70-something pounds of inert weight. She fit the body inside her medium-sized dark blue suitcase. Her plan was to bring her daughter back to Russia, but then, somewhere along the way, the reality of getting the suitcase through security with her daughter inside seemed impossible. She'd get caught. She panicked. She couldn't keep her daughter in the apartment, but she couldn't bring her daughter's remains to Russia either. She looked out onto the coastline, and she wheeled the suitcase down towards the water and dumped that suitcase into the Adriatic Sea. There was speculation that, with the weight of the suitcase and its contents, she might have had help. No, she insisted. She did this all alone. She then boarded her flight to Russia and kept what she did a secret, even to herself. Katerina's mother said she truly believed if she threw the body away, then the actuality of Katerina's death would go away. Katerina would be alive, and all this, her daughter's illness, her despair, her death, the disposal, never happened. Things could go back to the way they were, a devoted mother and her perfect girl. Gulnara could have stayed in Russia and avoided punishment, but she didn't. She decided to fly back to Italy. She turned herself in, and when she did, it made huge headlines. People didn't know what to make of the mother who tossed her daughter into the sea. And I felt the same way when I came across this story. I admit it was a combination of horror and judgment. I was fascinated by it too. The idea of a woman sitting by her daughter's bedside day after day after day. The human mind is capable of doing all kinds of things to deny that profound loss. Even find ways to pretend like that loss, it didn't happen. But it did happen, and Gulnara was going to have to face the consequences. What kind of punishment did a woman like this deserve? That was what Italian authorities had to decide now. In the spring of 2017, she was charged with improperly disposing of a corpse and negotiated a prison sentence of 14 months. This sentence was deferred indefinitely, which meant Gulnara wouldn't spend any time in prison. What's more, she was finally able to say goodbye to her daughter. On May 23, 2017, a Rimini charity group arranged a funeral service for Katerina. Her mother was in attendance, along with other close family members. She was buried in a local cemetery in Rimini. Katerina loved this city, her mother said, and now she can stay forever. Thank you for listening to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'll be back in a few days with an all-new true crime story. And until next time, nighty-night.